Hello and welcome to Beauty is a Virus, an artist talk with Anna Ridler. This talk is part of Kassel Documentary Film and Video Festival 2021. Anna Ridler's projects Myriad, Tulips, and Mosaic Virus are shown as part of the festival's exhibition Monitoring, Myth and Microgravity at Kasseler Kunstverein. Through this talk, we would like to give you a deeper insight into Anna's work and her research. My name is Verena Kuni. I'm a professor for visual culture studies at Goethe University Frankfurt am Main and director of Interfiction, an interdisciplinary workshop conference for art, media, and network cultures that is also taking place in the framework of the festival. But now, let me introduce our guest. Anna Ridler is an artist and researcher from London. To better understand our world, she's exploring potentials and problems, premises and pitfalls of our current techno-nature culture, an example by experimenting with creative entanglements and collisions between handmade artistic datasets and machine learning driven by algorithms. But now let me introduce our guest. Anna Ridler is an artist and researcher from London. To better understand our world, she's exploring potentials and problems, premises and pitfalls of our current techno-nature culture. An example by experimenting with creative entanglements and collisions between handmade artistic datasets and machine learning driven by algorithms. In the first part of our session, Anna will introduce you to her work. Afterwards, we'll have a little Q&A. Anna, thank you so much for being with us. We are excited to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be talking now for the next 40 minutes or so about my practice and about machine learning or artificial intelligence and why I think it's particularly interesting to work with. I'm an artist based in London who's really interested in systems of knowledge and how knowledge is formed and kept. And for the past 4 or 5 years, I've been working extensively with machine learning and artificial intelligence as part of my practice. I do everything myself from kind of build the data sets through to code everything up, through to then kind of creating the final installations. And for me, I found this way of working, and in particular this technology, to be particularly interesting because it's so entangled and because there are so many different parts to it. It's a very complex process. It works really nicely when you create very big projects where there isn't a single outcome, because the different strands of how it works give themselves to different parts of the project. It's this and it makes it ideal to explore large, complex ideas. And most of all, the thing that I find most interesting about it is that it's a way of exploring the world and society and reflecting on what we deem important and why. And it can open up these very big questions around ontology, around language, around meaning, around consciousness. And for me, that is a very, very exciting thing to kind of work with. It's becoming more and more, I feel, prevalent in kind of like the art world. And I'm going to talk through a little bit about this before moving on. So this is a paper. These are images that came from a paper from about 3 or 4 years ago that was done by a group in Facebook AI research, where they trained an artificial intelligence model on thousands of paintings in order for it to produce images in unconventional style. The idea of this experiment done by scientific researchers was to create art that is novel but not too novel. And then they put these images alongside paintings that real people had done, and then asked an audience to kind of rate these pictures as to which were the most novel, which were the most, how complex they thought each image was. And to the researchers' surprise, they found that in many, many cases, people preferred the images kind of created by artificial intelligence to the images created by kind of real artists. And to me, that's a really interesting starting point to kind of start to think about this idea of beauty and what it means. Because, and this is another kind of, these are some more images from this paper where kind of like one of the earliest experiments to kind of see whether a machine, an AI model could kind of create art. Because to me, it's the focus of this work and this focus of kind of talking about whether machines can kind of create art has been to judge and consider the result as art through kind of like this very, through the impact of kind of viewing something. Does it look like art? Does it seem like it should be art? And kind of ignores totally the role of the artist in kind of creating something. What is the concept? What are they trying to do? What is the impact of the materials that they're using? How is it displayed and considered by an audience? What are the different traces, histories, and connotations that should be considered when you're looking at this piece? You have a very different reaction, I think, to when you kind of look at a photograph than to a drawing and a painting. And one of the things that I'm really interested in my work is to kind of use the kind of histories that sit behind machine learning and sit behind artificial intelligence as part of my practice, and trying to bring those associations and connotations out through my work. And I think one of the things that kind of like always strikes me when talking about kind of like whether something is beautiful or not is that whether a painting is beautiful or not is also this kind of idea that something kind of like that it is just something that it's an object that kind of sits on the wall that kind of like displays beauty. And I think it's really important to consider this whole process that kind of goes into making an art. It's also one of the reasons why I find this piece, which was sold for $500,000 again a few years ago, very problematic as an artwork. It was kind of, to me, it's actually quite uninteresting because it ignores all the weirdness and all the kind of like interestingness that you can actually find when you work with machine learning. It was sold by Christie's on behalf of a collective, none of whom kind of considered themselves to be artists. But they kind of like, the way that the painting kind of like, this work is kind of being presented is very much in a traditional kind of old school style of kind of what art seems to be like. It's kind of framed as if it is a painting, even though it's a digitally generated object. It's been trained, or kind of like it's trying to mimic imagery that kind of like is coming from this very kind of classical idea of what a portrait should be. It's even got a signature that kind of looks like an algorithm on it. And it's very much pushing it and making it seem like a kind of traditional form of art. And it's kind of like, it's also very kind of like an interesting kind of like case in terms of kind of like case study in kind of machine learning art, because they also freely admit that the collective freely admit that they borrowed most of the elements that went into making this piece. They didn't create the data that went into training it. These are all historic paintings that are freely available to anyone. They didn't kind of create the code that kind of then went to kind of create the model. That was done by the scientist whose algorithm is featured on the painting. And they just kind of put all of that together. And one of the things that I think could be made more interesting about this piece is, you know, there's a long history of ready-mades in art history, but this piece is kind of not being put in that artistic field. Instead, it's kind of gesturing at the idea of a lone genius. And I think that's not as interesting for me when it kind of comes to kind of like discussing these things. There's so much more, so much weirder stuff that you can do with artificial intelligence, so many more questions that could be raised, that for me, it feels like this is not really doing that. the algorithm that I use to kind of create my work, and the one that I'm particularly interested in, is an algorithm, or a model rather, called a GAN, a generative adversarial network. This video playing now is actually from a science experiment that was done in, again, quite a long time ago in machine learning terms, and around 2017. But to me, it's still one of the most beautiful instances of kind of like of a demonstration of how these things work. GANs are notoriously unstable and not that well understood, complex iterative processes with many interdependencies, where one neural network learns to mimic imagery to the extent that counterfeits are indistinguishable from genuine articles over the course of many cycles of learning or epochs. So how this is otherwise commonly described is you have two networks. One is described as a forger network, and one is described as a detective network. And it's given a whole load of data. And then the forger network tries to produce an image that it thinks that it looks like it could come from that data that it was originally shown. And the detective network kind of looks at it and says whether it can or can't, whether it does or doesn't. And then it kind of like does this again and again and again until the forger network gets to the point where it can produce an image that fools the detective network. And those are the kind of images that you start to see here playing. And I really, as I said, I really love these imageries. They have this kind of meandering, dream-like quality to them, results that are recognizable as being real, but as soon as you actually pay close attention to them, they're so definitely not. But this is, and as I said, this is quite an old kind of like example, and the industry has become much, much better. And these are now the types of images that the same architectures, the same type of models are producing now. So what you just saw was from about, as I said, 2016, 2017. And these are the type of images that GANs are producing now. Kind of like the results are becoming better and better. The industry wants realism. This week alone, 282 papers were uploaded with new research on this topic. And because you now have photographs that look like this, or because you now have images that look like this, which is basically photography, I think this raises real questions about how and when to use it. Training these models, making this work is incredibly energy intensive. And so if you're using something to kind of create something that looks just like a photograph, I think there's a real question as to, why not just use a photograph? What is using machine learning? What is using artificial intelligence bringing to and helping kind of like resolve, or helping to kind of like, or exploring in a project? I think also there are, even though kind of like this photograph looks almost perfect, there still are tells that show that it isn't a real photograph, but you have to look incredibly closely to see them. These imperfections and these kind of traces of process will not last long, and they're already disappearing faster and faster. But it's a quality that I love and that I want to question and work with. But it's going to be a finite amount of time that these traces exist. The mistakes that you kind of get, and these kind of imperfections draw attention to the fact that these are kind of unreal images, or that they're kind of created images. And as soon as they stop being noticeable, as soon as they kind of like start to become too smooth and too much part of kind of like what you're looking at, people stop kind of paying attention to it. And once they start paying attention to it, they start questioning and challenging it. And I think this is particularly important when you start to talk about machine learning, because there are so many parts of the process that are difficult and ethically problematic and questions that still have not been resolved yet. But one of the things I think that maybe gives me some hope, or not hope is the wrong word, but I think one of the things that I think might be interesting in the future is that this kind of, because these images now are becoming so almost picture perfect, it might kind of create a different way of looking at images, a more precise, kind of intense way of kind of like regarding the picture, which might be in contrast to the way that we're just consuming so many of them every day. So one thing that I kind of also wanted to kind of mention, to bring it back to kind of like my own practice, I suppose, is that when you work with machine learning, you're kind of working really with kind of two major things. You're working with the algorithm that I mentioned before, the GAN or whichever model or architecture you're working with. And then you're also working with data, or the training set, the thing that is given to the algorithm from which it kind of constructs a world and from which it builds up its knowledge. The training set, or the data is incredibly important to the eventual output. And it's also something that is incredibly important to my practice. I often consider myself to be, in a way, a kind of data artist. For me, kind of like data isn't this cold algorithmic kind of element. For me, data is something that is incredibly human. Every piece of data is really kind of a trace of someone's life. And I find like a lot of my job as an artist is to take this and to try and kind of work with it and shape it and sculpt it to create something. A lot of the time I spend kind of creating kind of my data, or finding data, or cleaning data, or looking through data. And so it makes up a huge part of kind of like my studio practice. And it really, I think, it becomes this very human, tactile thing for me. When I've been working with it kind of in the context of machine learning, I'm often kind of reminded of encyclopedias. And in many ways, kind of like the training set for a machine learning model can kind of be seen as a contemporary encyclopedia. In the process of making an encyclopedia, categories are decided using various different kind of methodologies. They're filled in. People who do it are kind of often anonymous. They're often coming from positions of power. And I think that these kind of thinking about the training set as a contemporary encyclopedia is a way of kind of like thinking through how these models are trying to construct these very simplified versions of reality, and thinking about them as well, you sometimes can kind of start to come to grasp with the difficulties that appear along the way of when you're trying to take the entire world and then condense it down to something that's kind of like, that can kind of sit in kind of like at a small scale. The data sets that are needed to kind of create training sets are often extremely large. So in order to kind of like train a model, you're really looking at thousands and thousands, sometimes millions of images and inputs, and they're very often proprietary. Shown on screen now is an open source data set called ImageNet, which is a canonical data set that's often used in computer vision research. And which I'm going to talk a little bit about. Data sets, the ones that are readily available are compiled by researchers using a variety of different methodologies, but often by mechanical Turks whose invisible labor and associated power relationships are rarely acknowledged. And it's often a hugely ambitious and expensive undertaking. to create ImageNet took 25,000 workers over a 2-year period using Amazon Mechanical Turk. But one of the things that I think is really important to kind of think about, which I gestured at a little bit before, was that because people are always involved in this process of kind of selecting images, labeling images, categorizing images, deciding what definitions are, because people are always involved, at some point, there will always be kind of the potential to have kind of cultural bias embedded in these data sets. And so you will always have this data set bias that will always be inside it. For example, ImageNet, this has been cleaned now, but this is one of my favorite examples, is that if you kind of go through the 14 million images, and kind of start to look at the kind of definitions on the one side and then the photographs that kind of accompany it on the other, if you look at this kind of like definition of what beauty is, it's this very kind of like sexualized, very female, young woman kind of examples that are given. And this is what the algorithm kind of learns what this is. And this is the kind of like only source material it has for it. There's nothing else for it to kind of understand except from this. The other example that I kind of like always like, again, from ImageNet is the one for Monster, because although there are kind of like what are clearly Marvel characters or kind of like Frankenstein, there's also kind of like punks and kind of like children who are disabled that have kind of come under this category. And because these data sets, these kind of off-the-shelf data sets are so large, they're kind of like, as I said, 14 million images, it's almost impossible to kind of go through each and every photograph and kind of trace where it's come from and to kind of see what's been included or excluded and what biases and prejudices are being repeated and replicated. And it's very difficult to kind of to control really what you're doing with it. There have been a number of kind of creative projects that have attempted to kind of like draw attention to these problems. Notably Trevor Paglen and Kate Crawford's ImageNet Roulette, which do a really good job of like drawing attention to this, and there has been real change that has been affected by this. But for me, I don't feel comfortable using off-the-shelf kind of like data sets. For me, it's really, really important to kind of work with and create my own data sets. And I either do that through kind of generating it myself, so making kind of the photographs, making drawings, making whatever imagery, sound, or by kind of like maybe taking something from an existing source, but looking at everything, kind of maybe touching every piece of data, kind of doing something to it so that I feel like I have a connection to it. It becomes an extremely important creative act. And it's kind of one of the real things that is within my control. And there is a real art to this. Up until very, very recently, British copyright law considered a database to be a literary work, acknowledging the skill that went into it. And I think in maybe 50 years' time, dataset creators will also have their own separate laws to kind of preserve their copyright. So this is a very, very long preamble into kind of like what I'm interested in with machine learning and why I'm kind of using it in my own work, which is on show as part of the exhibition. This piece is called Mosaic Virus. I'm just going to play a very short clip of it. And it's part of a multi-year project that looks at tulips, machine learning, and ideas around speculation and capitalism. Mosaic Virus 2019 bring these ideas around capitalism, value, and collapse from two very different points in history. That it's making links between the ongoing speculation around cryptocurrencies to the moment in the 1630s called tulip mania, where the price of a tulip bulb went for the same, allegedly at its height, went for the same amount of money as an Amsterdam townhouse, which to me just seems very, very crazy. It's also gesturing at a further mode of speculation around artificial intelligence. We're kind of living through a moment of hype around AI. And so you've got these three moments that are kind of all drawn together here. The video playing, each of the stills is created using a GAN. It's created using using artificial intelligence, and it's controlled by the price of Bitcoin. So the tulips morph and shift and change shape according to the price of Bitcoin. As the price goes up, the tulips become more stripy and more open before kind of collapsing as the price goes down. The reason why the kind of stripe is controlling the tulip is kind of gestured at in the name, Mosaic Virus. Mosaic Virus was the name of a disease that caused the stripes in the tulip petals. And this was something that kind of was not known at the time during tulip mania. It was something that was only really discovered in the 1630s, I think. But because people at the time didn't understand why one year a tulip could be entirely plain and the next have stripes, this helped cause kind of the speculative value around the tulips that had stripes. They became they were the most valuable at some points during this mania. And so that's why the name, that's why the link is there. The stripy tulips were the most valuable, and those are the ones, that's kind of how the price of Bitcoin is visualized in this piece. What's also quite nice about the Mosaic Virus is that it's one of the very rare instances of at least in botany, of a disease actually increasing the value of a plant. And it has this kind of strange alchemy to it almost. So this is the moving image. This is how it's seen in installation view. And it kind of, to me, it was this really nice connection to bring together these kind of ideas. But as I mentioned, I didn't really want to kind of like just use kind of machine learning as a way of just because it was a tool, just because it was there. I really wanted to think about how it worked to further pull out some of the themes of the piece. So the notion of kind of the boom and bust of the markets is also evidenced in the way that GANs work. So when you're working with GANs, you have something called a learning rate. So it kind of which goes up and up over time as the algorithm starts to understand more and more and more of what is going on. But sometimes you get these moments where it will kind of go up and up and up and then suddenly collapse. As I said, kind of GANs are very unstable. So as the model kind of like tries to kind of encapsulate the perfect beauty of a tulip, its collapse mirrors the ups and downs of the speculative bubbles. If you look about how it behaves exactly the same as the price when I was making it, when I was trying to kind of like get it to learn what a tulip looked like. It behaved exactly the same as the price did of kind of tulip bulbs during the tulip mania and cryptocurrency during the boom, kind of like going up and down. So as a material, it's echoing its subject matter. Furthermore, there is a long kind of history of kind of tulips in art history. They're kind of like, can also be, you can also kind of think of there being an echo of how a gang constructs an image of a tulip to the way that kind of Dutch still life painters created the very famous vanitas paintings. I also like the connection here because, you know, these vanitas paintings were meant to emphasize how fleeting worldly treasure like and beauty were. And so it makes that connection to the stock market quite nice. The way that kind of these painters kind of constructed or painted these works is very, very similar, I think, in my mind, to how a gang uses the database. These paintings kind of showed flowers from spring and summer and autumn and even occasionally winter. If you look at this, like there's no way that these flowers would all bloom at once, all bloom at the same time. Instead, what would happen is that the painters would kind of use their sketches, use their knowledge, use their kind of all of the kind of insight that they had to kind of create these imagined bouquets. They wouldn't be kind of painting from a real bouquet of flowers in the studio. And this is very similar to how my model is kind of creating the tulips that you saw before. It's not repeating the photographs that were in the data set, but rather it's kind of taking kind of fragments from each of them to construct a new imagined type of flower, not repeating something from kind of like from observation, but rather using all of the knowledge that it has to create something new. So kind of for me, because I wanted to make this connection and because I wanted to, and for all the reasons that I talked about before, I couldn't just kind of go and say that I want to, you know, go onto Google and find a data set. I kind of had to create my own. I took 10,000 photographs of tulips while I was on residency in the Netherlands in Utrecht over the course of several months. And the reason that I kind of stopped at 10,000 wasn't because it was a nice round number, although it is. I stopped because it was the end of tulip season. So even though this piece is very much a digital piece that is kind of made using digital technology and thinking about digital kind of systems, it's very much grounded in the rhythms of nature. It kind of making this kind of data set was an incredibly physical experience. Carrying hundreds of tulips is a very heavy thing to do. And it's also a very expensive thing to do. So, you know, you have to acknowledge that in order to kind of create your own data set, you need to kind of come from a position where you can afford to spend money on the object that you're photographing. And there really is a skill to it. You have this very kind of intimate connection to what you're working with. You really kind of like, you know, you're stripping each of the tulips, you're photographing, you're holding them, you understand kind of what is in that data set. And there's this kind of tension, I think, between the craft and the kind of speed in which you're kind of making the data set versus the kind of the way that you're kind of coding up an algorithm and kind of what your brain is doing there. And I think in order to kind of work in the way that I work, where you're doing both parts of it, you have to hold these two very different and at times very contradictory states of being in your head, where you're happy to work slow and where, you know, you've kind of got a lot of space and time to kind of think, versus kind of like when you're coding things up, which is very high mental load and you're utterly focused on one thing. But without this kind of connection to the data, I feel that the project would be a lot less strong. And you start to kind of like, and it becomes this very iterative process where you're kind of taking photographs, building a data set, testing a model, seeing what it comes out, and then kind of shifting and maybe changing your data set, adding more in of a certain type of tulip because it's overfitting to that. And you want to kind of get rid of that, adding maybe more of a certain type of color, finding different things, and you start to kind of like really build this relationship that I don't think it's possible to do if you're just kind of scraping things from the internet or using something that someone else has created. Because of this, I also wanted to kind of like, I also wanted to kind of draw out kind of like the kind of the history of data sets in this piece as well, because it's not just a piece about, as I said before, I'm really interested in kind of like building out these kind of histories and connotations that sit in the technology that I use. And there's been a long history of floral data sets. This is the Iris dataset that was created by Ronald Fisher in the 1930s and is used as a test case for many statistical machine learning techniques. And what I really like about this is that it also is part of the program scikit-learn. So whenever you're kind of using that, and many kind of machine models or many machine learning kind of like pieces of code do, you're automatically downloading a Iris dataset onto your computer. So I really love the idea that there are, you know, hundreds, thousands, millions of Iris datasets sitting on people's computers who work in this field without their knowledge, but just, or, you know, maybe they know, maybe they don't know, but they're there. And it's kind of very much kind of like embedded into this program. Kind of like, and so this kind of piece is also kind of gesturing at that history of flower data sets. And I wanted to kind of make the data set into an artwork in and of itself because of the time and the effort and the labor and the skill that went into making it. And so the piece became Myriad Tulips, which is an installation of thousands of hand-labeled photographs. And by choosing to make the data set as an artwork rather than just leaving it as kind of something that sits on a hard drive, I really feel that it kind of draws attention to that human kind of like skill that goes into making things. And exposes that the touch as well that is usually hidden by algorithmic processes. It's easy to forget in the digital age that information is physical and that things that are seen on the screen once started out in the real world. And I think that by bringing this installation kind of back into the real world, it enables people to comprehend aspects of the data that they might not have done before. By choosing to kind of handwrite the labels as well, I kind of like also draw attention to the act of categorization. Computability is often accomplished by categorization. In order for a particular image to be retrieved or understood within a data set, it needs to have a label. And in the installation, you can kind of see that each photograph has a handwritten label with some of the categories that were used: the color of the tulip, for example, the state of the flower, the stripiness of the petal. And it draws attention to the subjectivity that accompanies such decisions and shows how difficult it is to put things into discrete categories. Is something white or pale pink? Is it orange or is it yellow? Is it a bud or is it just started to bloom? And you start to kind of understand how easy it is for something for material form to be lost when it's translated into language, and how the result is always that of someone choosing choosing words. Machine learning is so heavily dependent on language and categorization, and this is not always an absolute correct thing. What I perceive as an orange flower could very well be seen as yellow by someone else. And this really, I feel, kind of like brings out an issue that I talked about before around data sets. Implicit bias becomes virtually unavoidable. But by using my own photographs that I have taken, I'm able to impose greater control over the meaning of the images and how they're eventually processed. And the resulting errors and assumptions are mine and mine alone. And as I mentioned before, the installation, a small part of which is being shown, the full installation is around 50 square meters, gives this overwhelming sense of the time, money, and effort that goes into constructing a data set. Each photograph is carefully affixed by one with magnets to a specially painted black wall in a laborious process in a seemingly precise grid, invoking the imperfect and arduous human labor that is behind machine learning, and also its imperfection. And then I just very briefly want to talk about the final piece in this series of work called Blumen Veiling, which means flower auction in Dutch, which was an early piece of NFT art. It was an online auction of short GAN-generated videos of tulips and used smart contracts on the Ethereum network to sell the work and bots to help drive speculative prices. It was made in collaboration with David Fowl, a scientist. And again, it's kind of looking at this relationship between speculation, hype, and value. Through the use of these types of technologies, which are increasingly embedded across different types of market, it seeks to look at the way that technology drives human desire and the economic dynamics through artificial scarcity. Although it is an artwork for a gallery show, it was also a fully functioning, decentralized application. So it really worked. It's essentially kind of like I built a nifty gateway. And it works as a working example of what it also critiques. Blockchain is an abstract concept and does not lend itself immediately to visual or experimental expression. Again, it's this complex interconnected systems that are usually hidden from the end user. The process of creating our own Ethereum smart contracts and web front end for auctions uncovered the massive inefficiencies and complexities inherent in creating a DApp. They're obscured if you're using a third-party platform. While kind of a decentralized application looks and feels like a normal website, but much slower, the back end is this tangled nest of components which kind of are necessary in order to kind of interact with the blockchain. And this efficiency was highlighted by the enormous amount of energy that was required to run the Ethereum network. Minting a single NFT with Ethereum is estimated to require as much energy as a typical European household uses in a month. And there's this kind of tension I feel in my work between this kind of like way that several supercomputers worth of power is used to build something, a replica of the natural world, and far more energy than the cultivation of an actual flower. A major use of the blockchain in the art world is to introduce scarcity to digital works. And there's an inherent tension, I think, between these types of works and how they should naturally behave. Infinite tulips could be produced by me using this technology, but the ones that are only valuable are the ones that are associated with the finite supply of tokens. We wanted to exaggerate this artificial scarcity that is a critical part of the blockchain process by making the tokens self-destroying after a fixed amount of time. The smart contracts which enabled the sale and defined the work in the technical process were used to mirror how real tulips behave, so that the decay and impermanence of the natural world was reintroduced into the digital world. the contracts were programmed to show the video work for a week, approximately the same amount of time that a cut tulip lasts before the tulip was blighted and disappeared from the owner's view. And this was meant to kind of allow the viewer to appreciate the work as a work of art rather than a commodity, making it temporary and therefore difficult to trade. And it was kind of interesting to play about with kind of using the technology in this way. When we made the work, it seemed obvious to us that NFTs would be used as a way to kind of securely grant the owner of a token the right to view a given an artwork. And we didn't really imagine that there would be how the market for NFTs would grow and change so that the artworks could be freely viewed and shared by anyone. The logic of commodification proved more adept and malleable than we could have foreseen even a few years ago. And it seems certain that it will mutate and change into stranger forms in the future. And just to kind of end, I just kind of want, and to bring it back to kind of to kind of how I started the talk and thinking about kind of how I bring this into my practice and why I find it interesting. A lot of the time, kind of the digital arts, or particularly machine learning and generative art, are seen as being this kind of like algorithmic, in the lineage of algorithmic and rule-based art. But for me, this isn't necessarily the case. I find it much more relevant and much more inspiring to think of it in the context of land and environmental art. I feel my job as an artist is to set up all the variables, to kind of consider all the things that could happen that I would want, and then allow something, elements, water, plants, or in my case, a model, bots, kind of like people bidding on something in an auction, to work on it in a way that you can predict, but you cannot control. And this, for me, is really what I find beautiful about working with this. Thank you.
So, dear Anna, thank you so much for this inspiring presentation. And now for our, however brief, Q&A, let us perhaps start with two of the areas of research your work is focusing on. And here I'm quoting from your wonderful website. First, language and classification with investigations into the pathways between words, definitions, and data. And second, recording nature, tracing the lineage of natural history through the use of technology. End of quote, if you want. Actually, my impression was that your recent projects are all about the intersection of these areas. So could you please expand on this intersection a little bit and tell us a little more about your perspective on it? Like how far technologies, especially digital technologies and tools, have changed the way we look at and work with these entanglements on the one hand side, and on the other hand side, in how far it is, at least up till now, just same, but a little different compared to the ways these intersections were formed in earlier times. Well, I could not help to think in this context about the example you have shown in ImageNet, the ways images are sorted in the category like usus naturae or monsters. Another example would be for sure databases used for face recognition, surveillance, and control. So beauty may sometimes ask for deviance, but societies and systems based on normativity rather do not. And so I think these intersections are a crucial point, and that's why I would be curious to learn more about your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think since working in this way, you're right that these two kind of like separate research areas are collapsing more and more into each other. I think I mentioned it a little bit in the presentation, but language is so key to working with these types of technology. You have to kind of label everything. You're working with language every time that you code. And so it's very inherent in how things are kind of structured. And ontology is, I think, and ontological processes are very important when you're kind of thinking about how machine learning works, how these worlds are constructed. And because of this, I think my interest in the natural world is moving more and more into issues around measurement and quantification. And how do you take something and kind of categorize it? How do you measure it? How do you quantify it? What language are you using? How is it being done? How are things being obscured or changed through this process of kind of measuring it so that it can be legible for a machine? Because machines kind of like in many ways are very stupid. They only understand what you give them, and you really need to kind of articulate everything. So if you give a machine a load of photographs of cats and there's one photograph of a dog, it won't automatically know that that is a photograph of a dog. If you just say that these are cats, it won't be able to have that knowledge. It's so reliant on kind of what you tell it. And so for me, kind of like trying to kind of look at this and construct these things from the ground up really kind of shows the difficulties and the problems that are inherent in doing it. And I think this does kind of flow quite naturally into the history of natural history and this very Enlightenment idea that, you know, you can take the world and describe it in a book. And I think it sits in that lineage of work of artists working kind of to question that assumption and look at how kind of like we have kind of like, as I said, kind of formed and kept knowledge in the past and continue to do so now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And just to shift a little in the perspective and also to come back to some of your projects, like within the systems based on normativity, and we experience this like every day in the internet culture. Within these systems, divines can become a fetish and sometimes also trigger a gold rush, just like the Mosaic Virus in the end. So coming back to your tulips, diving deeper into the earlier history of digital network culture, we find more than 20 years ago, the almost legendary .com gold rush of the late 1990s that ended with its very own Black Fridays, the burst of the .com bubble, and so on. And with far-reaching, and this is perhaps the point, consequences also for those who had not been speculating on the stock market, but were working in the cultural sectors related to and or depending on the digital technologies, as a lot of money was sucked out of this sector. So in that very year, in 2000, active members of the NetTime network like Geert Loevink and Eric Kluitenberg from Amsterdam organized a conference with the aim to develop an informed critique of digital economies and economics. And referring to the very history you are referring to as well, they called this conference tulipomania.com. What do you think our times are sharing, not only with the 17th century, but also with the late 1990s? What is different and what has changed?
I mean, I'm not the first person to make the connection between tulips and speculation and also the connection to cryptocurrency. I mean, I think even in like 2015, some central banks were calling cryptocurrencies worse than tulip mania. I think there are kind of like some parallels, I think, to the 17th century and now, kind of like in the way that kind of like everything seems to be, you've kind of got the start of global trade kind of happening then. You've got a lot of commodification. You've got all of the kind of issues that kind of fall out from that, which I think we're still kind of seeing today, and in the way that kind of like with global supply chains, with all of those kind of like with all of those things. I am less kind of knowledgeable about like the 1990s boom and bust bubbles there, but I'm sure there are also kind of parallels between the huge amounts of money that are being pumped into certain sectors and certain industries by people who don't necessarily understand the technology, but who see it as a way of getting rich quick, which is certainly what is happening, I think, around crypto, certainly what happened around tulips. And I think it's probably what happened with the dot-com bubble as well.
Yeah, actually, it was not so much a lesson in history I wanted to go into, but this very specific connections to the creative sector and to culture and net culture, because I think it's often overseen how deep and vast the consequences of the connections to the sector are. I mean, we have we are not really behind the pandemic, but we have faced months of a pandemic where the whole cultural sector was like, on the one hand side, almost irrelevant compared to economics. At least in Germany, this was often said. But on the other hand side, everyone was fleeing into the sector because, well, beauty was a resort. It was like the wellness resort for those who were facing lockdown and so on. So, but this is just a special example. To come back to the tulipomania connection, it was really like in that late 1990s that big museums dependent on private money were trying to buy and feature net.art or digital art. And when the money went out of the tech decks, of course, this money was really lost for culture. Just one example, but to come to the connection to our current time, I could not help to draw it as your tulips are also reflecting about the current Russian crush on Bitcoin by drawing this direct parallel to the tulip market and the tulipomania. And now connecting the dots further to the more recent gold rush on NFTs, on non-fungible tokens, seems likewise obvious, but it might also reveal some problems and pitfalls of the digital economies and economics that are especially relevant for artists and other creators, problems that have been critically discussed since these times of tulipomania.com conference and even beyond. There has been praise for NFTs as a possibility for digital art to finally enter the traditional art market, as NFTs allow people to create or perhaps simulate the uniqueness of an original in a medium that is all about lossless copy, allowing endless shares. But herein, we find a notable difference to the tulip bulbs. These, the bulbs, the flowers, had been naturally rare or rare by nature, while there's actually no real necessity for rarefication in digital art except for the economy of its creators. And so the big question, I think, still remains, do artists really have to become traders, or do they have to buy into recent trends at least? Your digital tulips probably rather invite us to look us for alternatives, for other means to remunerate people for their creative work, for different digital economies, if you want. So what do you think about this context? Because you're also working in the digital sector. Your work could be perhaps in some cases copied as well, and so on.
Yeah, no, I think the NFT space is genuinely interesting, I think, in the possibilities that it can give artists to be to earn a living. I mean, I have created some NFTs and I have made money off them, but I think there is this tension. I think there's all sorts of issues around kind of like, I think, the ethics of using them in terms of energy usage, and kind of there's all sorts of issues around kind of like, I think also access. I think you have to be able to kind of like, it's not, it still requires kind of like a high degree of literacy, I think, to kind of to buy an NFT, you need to kind of have a wallet, you need to have kind of like be able to kind of like understand how to kind of like buy and trade cryptocurrencies and things like that. So it like the market, it doesn't open up necessarily the market in the way that I think it's sometimes assumed to do so. I think that kind of like there are some things, and I think there are some things that you can do that are really nice with smart contracts. I think working with the smart contract as a technology is something that I'm very interested in doing. So doing things like I did with the Blumen Veiling project, where, you know, things would decay or things would disappear. I've done some other ones where things kind of like build as the project, as the NFT gets traded. And I think that's quite nice, to kind of think about how you can kind of like create your art in a way that kind of like will grow over time and that is embedded in that, in the way that it's sold. But it's very much a system that is built on, I suppose, a lack of trust. It assumes that kind of like you need to kind of check everything. I think for me, that's also something that I think about a lot when I use it and I work with it. And I think it's emerging. It's definitely in its own speculative bubble at the moment. The prices that pieces go for are just incredible. But I think it's good to reward kind of digital artists, some of whom have been working on this stuff for many, many, many years, and who've never kind of like been seen as kind of like proper artists, and who now are being able to make a living from their work.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely right. On the one hand side, on the other hand side, I think that just as you have to be smart within the system to buy and to use really the system to buy art or to sell art. It's also it's a very special market also in terms of aesthetics, as we're talking about beauty as a virus. This is a certain virus. There are other viruses like the concept virus or the more traditional beauty virus, and so perhaps it's the problem with art that it's always about distinction, and so each subgroup has their own fetishes.
Yeah, no.
But yeah.
No, I was going to say there's definitely an NFT aesthetic, I think.
Yes, definitely. But to come back to AI, that has become also a fetish in art and art production, and you've mentioned it in the beginning of your talk. So another idea could be, should artists try to become the better machines, reproducing the rather old school, traditional, conservative ideas of beauty and of art, rather than developing their own approaches, writing their own algorithms and training their own AIs. I was thinking about, of course, we would say, oh no, they should, just as you are doing it in a great way, work hands-on their own data sets, on their own algorithms, and really train their own AIs. But then there's still the question, can we, within the system, escape this self-fulfilling prophecies and premises of machine learning and AI, as we have to also adapt and we have to adapt to the systems we are using in a way. And this relates to the concepts, like the concept of art, what is beauty, what is aesthetics, as well as the system thinking, how do I train a system? What is my idea of learning, if we are talking about machine learning? So, well, I often feel when I'm thinking about machine learning and AI, not only in the context of art, like thrown back to the basic problems of didactics and pedagogy.
Yeah, I think I have kind of like taken a very particular approach in how I work with machine learning. And I don't think it's necessarily the approach that everyone should take. I mean, I think as this is becoming more and more kind of part of kind of like our daily lives, and also part of kind of like how artists who work with technology, one of the kind of tools or processes that they have to work with. I think different artists might choose to kind of explore different aspects of it as a system. I mentioned before kind of artists like Trevor Packlin and Kate Crawford, who very much work with kind of pre-built, pre-made kind of pieces of code or data sets, to do some really interesting work around that reveals kind of like a lot about our implicit biases, or kind of how kind of systems are kind of structuring the world. And I think that is a really good example of people who are doing really great work with these systems that kind of like off the shelf. And I think that as more and more people, like, I think it's possible to use it in very different ways and to explore a multitude of kind of very kind of like of concepts, of ideas, of philosophies. And I think that one of the things that I find exciting looking at kind of like artists who are working with this is how broad it can be. And I think it will become, or I hope it will become, something that kind of like everyone works with, because you can use it in a very documentary based way, where you're kind of really reporting on and revealing truths about society, but you can use it in a very kind of, I suppose, kind of like, I can't think of the word, but in a way where you're kind of imagining and creating kind of things that are entirely like unbounded by reality.
Well, reality is a good point. Of course, all our digital and network life is reality. But then I think it's really important, and especially in times when certain companies are now called meta to create metaverses in plural, that it's really important how you relate the digital and the analog and their different intersections. So at least I was thinking that many of your projects do this in a very innovative and also characteristic way, like drawing back to analog material, objects, tools, also techniques and practices, and then shift these into digital spheres, but keeping also the connections. So I was curious if this is also because you want to invite us to learn from history, not only in order to repeat it, but also to keep with the treasures of individual and collective cultural memories and activities, and of course also to activate them for new insights and perspectives. And if so, or if not, what is your focus in this process and sorting out different connections and again, entanglements, working with these transfers and transformations between the material cultures and the media cultures?
I think it's very much part of my process, and it's something that kind of naturally, I think, lends itself to working with this technology, is to kind of to take, because I think because it is so layered and it is so complex, you're able to kind of pull out multiple different strands of things. And so for me, kind of like the more I research a single object, and it does tend to be like a single object, the more I'm able to kind of like telescope out and find these connections that are kind of hidden inside these kind of different technologies that I'm using. And they'll often be kind of like, I will often start by kind of trying to find something that is kind of like quite analog or quite physical, and then seeing how that kind of like, how its history can kind of connect into whatever the technologies that I'm working with at the time are. And so often when I'm working, I kind of like I never really kind of have a fully formed project until kind of midway through. It's always kind of like experimenting and playing and trying to connect these two things, these two sides of the kind of analog and the digital together, the kind of object and the concept. And more often than not, they do kind of like, it is possible to kind of get them to connect in some way. Because I think sometimes when you're thinking about technologies, and particularly kind of like the systems of technologies, they're so large, they're so abstract, they're so complicated, that it's very difficult, at least it is for me, to kind of truly understand them without kind of like using an object as a way of kind of like understanding them. And so that's kind of often why I've ended up making the work that I've made.
Actually, I often think art is doing this job very well, at least yours. So yeah, really, I'm one of these persons who feels connected to the world when looking at and thinking about art projects like your ones. So, well, we should probably soon come to an end. But before we do so, could you perhaps, or do you want to give us a glimpse of your current next project, or is it
no, I've just got a grant, and I'm going to be working with Gluon, an organization based in Brussels, over the next year, over 2020 to next year. I'm going to be working with them on a project around water capitalism and thinking about how water is valued or not valued, and the social constructs that kind of surround kind of the idea of the value of water in a region that is traditionally quite water stressed. And so I'm really excited to start thinking about that and start to kind of like understand the interplay of weather and climate and nature, and the commodification of water.
Wow, this sounds fantastic. And also like on the one hand side, we would have some metaphors like the fluid that connects directly to the digital, but then it's also like hacked water suppliers one could think of. Wow, great. So yeah, as already mentioned, we have to come to an end, sadly, for today at least. So thank you so much for your talk and for your answers, for your work, and for your time, Anna.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your interesting questions. They really made me think a lot about these projects in a different way.
Thank you. So this talk is part of Kassel Documentary Film and Video Festival 2021. Just in case you are in Kassel during the festival days, don't miss Anna Ridler's projects Myriad, Tulips, and Mosaic Virus, shown as part of the festival's exhibition Monitoring, Mood and Microgravity at Kasseler Kunstverein. And thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.